Hello learners, in this video we're going to be going through our second practice paper for AQA English Language Paper 2. So you can see how we will structure our answers, what sort of things the examiner will be looking for in an answer, and then you can use this as inspiration for your exam.
Hello everyone, welcome to our GCSE English Language Practice Set 2 with AQA. I want to go through a couple of things just before we get started that I think are important pieces of information for you to take note of. So firstly, you get 1 hour and 45 minutes for this paper, and it's broken up into two sections, Section A and then Section B. For Section A, you have 4 questions, and I would advise spending an hour on that, with 50 minutes for reading the extracts that you need to read for them, and then 45 minutes for answering the questions. And then in Section B, you've got one big question, and that is worth spending 45 minutes on as well, just so you get 45 minutes on answering questions for 40 marks in Section A, and 45 minutes for 40 marks in Section B as well. And in total, you can see at the bottom there that the whole paper is worth 80 marks, 40 for A and 40 for B. So that's why I would suggest dividing your time up that way, so you've got an equal amount of time for equal amount of marks. Now, on the next slide, what I'm just going to do is go through how you can achieve those marks with the assessment objectives that you're gearing yourself towards. So we're just going to have a look at the assessment objectives, which ones apply, which ones don't, and then we'll have a look at the questions that you have available in this mock paper as well. So you can see there are 6 assessment objectives available to you, and there are 4 for Section A and 2 for Section B. So you have 4 assessment objectives for Section A across both Paper 1 and Paper 2. Now in this paper, AO4 does not apply to us because that applied only to Paper 1. So we are actually just looking at 1, 2 and 3, and AO3 doesn't apply in Paper 1, that only applies in Paper 2. So let's have a little look through those. Now in the first one, you've got I can identify explicit and implicit information from the text. I can interpret explicit and implicit ideas from the text. I can select facts from texts, and I can combine evidence from texts. So essentially with AO1, it's all about showing your understanding, being able to identify and understand information that you are reading about. It includes being able to identify quotations really carefully and select them exactly as you need to prove your points, and combining your ideas with evidence as well. So it's essentially your points that you're making and the evidence that you are using to prove those points. AO2 is all about analysis. So you can see there it says, I can explain how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers. I can comment on this, and I can analyse this. And then the final one says, I use appropriate subject terminology to support my views in my writing. So essentially, with all 4 of those bullet points, you are considering how writers create meaning through the language that they use and through the structural features that they use. And you're using terminology that you are taught in English to support that. So for example, it could be that a certain adjective creates a certain image, and you are thinking about how that kind of image is conveyed to readers. What does it create in our minds? And you might say a simile does that, a metaphor does that. It could be a sudden shift in tone that creates some kind of panic for readers or tension for readers. So you're thinking essentially, what has the writer done to create an interesting piece of writing for readers or craft some kind of image? That's what it's all about, and using the terms that you know to prove it, to show off the terminology that you have gained throughout your time studying English. The next one is AO3, and with AO3 this is exclusively for question 4, and this is all about comparison. So it says I can compare writers' ideas and perspectives across 2 or more texts, and I can compare how writers' ideas and perspectives are conveyed to the audience across 2 or more texts. So this is all about how writers in non-fiction writing get across their feelings, get across their perspectives, their viewpoints, and so on, through the evidence that you have. So you can use quotations to prove what you think about their ideas, But the important thing here is making sure that you consider methods and how methods convey their feelings. So it could be that, for example, a piece of dialogue conveys some kind of frustration, or it could be that some repetition conveys some kind of excitement, and you're considering how that is done. But crucially, you are comparing how that is done as well. So there's a difference perhaps between how one person conveys their feelings about a day trip to the beach compared to the other person who was maybe quite bored at the beach, and you're getting that across through comparative connectives as well. Now don't forget, the reason why it doesn't apply to paper 1 is that you only have one extract in paper 1, and in paper 2 you've got 2 extracts as a comparison, so that skill only applies for this paper. AO4 only applies to paper 1 because that's evaluating one text. Now as we move on to AO5 and AO6, you can see that it says section B writing, so this is all about the writing question. You will be in question 5 writing some non-fiction texts, whether that be you being asked to write a speech, a letter, an article, so on, and these skills allow you to do that effectively. So in AO5, this is all about how you're putting your writing together and the things that you are ultimately saying. So you've got, I can communicate clearly in my writing, and clarity is crucial for the sort of higher marks in this question as well. If it is not clear, then it will not be an effective piece of writing. So every time it is marked, your examiners will be looking for clarity as the most important thing. That comes above all of the other bullet points in the mark scheme I'm going to show you later, so it's worth just keeping that in mind for later on in this video. I can communicate effectively and imaginatively in my writing, so your clarity isn't just kind of, oh, this makes sense, it's engaging, it's really, really thoughtful, and it's a little bit different, it's original with the idea of it being imaginative. I can select and adapt tone, style, register and forms for different audiences and purposes in my writing. So this just goes back to the idea of, if it's a speech, it's got to sound like a speech. If it's an article, it's got to look like an article. If it's a letter, it's got to look like a letter. So you're just considering the different forms that you're being asked to sort of adhere to and making it look like it's supposed to look. You've also got the word audience in there as well, so being really careful about whether you're speaking to teenagers or whether you're speaking to a member of parliament, for example. So it's being adaptive to the things that the question is asking of you specifically in that paper. Finally, you've got, I can arrange information ideas using structural and grammatical features to support coherence and cohesion of texts. So essentially you are building your writing, and typically you're arguing in this question for paper 2 specifically. So you're building your writing up to that argument, solidifying that argument as you go. So there is no doubt in your reader's mind or in your listener's mind, if it's a speech that you've written, to really, really agree and have no room for doubt in what you are arguing and communicating. You're doing that through structure and clarity and grammar as well. And now as we move on to AO6, you have got all things SPAG. So you can see there the bullet points talk about vocabulary, sentences, spelling and punctuation. So all of these essentially will allow your writing to be more clear as well. So this is what I mean when I say clarity is the thing that I will look at first, and that comes through all of those tiny features like your vocabulary, structuring your sentences correctly, your punctuation and so on. Vocabulary actually comes up in AO5 and AO6 in the sort of more detailed mark scheme that we'll see later. But you can see there it says I can use it for effect and for purpose. So you're not just throwing in sort of loads and loads of huge words that you think sound great when actually contextually they don't fit in with what you're trying to say. You're using them because you know that it's effective in that particular moment. The second bullet point says I can use a range of sentence structures, so clarity, purpose and effect. You've got that word clarity again. And you're varying your sentence types to suit the argument that you're making. So it might be that a simple sentence really stands out in a particular point that you're trying to make, kind of makes that particular moment stand out for your reader. It might be that you need a really, really detailed one to convey a really important fact that you have. But again, you're thinking about those purposefully, not just throwing them in there because you think that you should. And then finally, you've got I can use accurate spelling and punctuation. Again, that just adds to clarity. If you're punctuating in the correct places, Your sentences will end and start where they should. There'll be pauses where there should be. So it will really, really make sense for your reader, again, ultimately the examiner. The first thing I want to do is have a quick look through the questions, and the reason why I want to do that is because when you're reading for the first time, you then will know what you're looking for, have a decent idea what to look for. And because you've got 2 extracts in paper 2 rather than 1, but still frustratingly the same amount of time, you want to maximise your time where you can. So let's have a quick look at these and just take note in our minds what we'll be looking for as we read it in the following slides. So we've got question 1 here. Now obviously I've not put the statements there, but this is just so you know where to look for explicit information. We might just want to draw a box around those lines just so we know where we're looking afterwards when we start on the questions properly. You've got read again, the first part of source A from lines 1 to 10, and there will be 4 statements which are true. It's a nice easy one, but it's just there for your reference. The second one, it says you need to refer to source A and source B for this question. That's the whole of both. And it says write a summary of the differences in the purposes of the 2 texts. Now it might be, for example, that one of the texts kind of serves to send a message or a lesson to readers, and in another it might be quite informative or quite opinionated. Now in our case, the blog in source A is kind of an inspirational sort of life lesson for readers, and in source B it's kind of an eyewitness account. So we can obviously look at that in more detail shortly, but just in terms of purpose, source B, for example, is not there to instruct anyone. It's an eyewitness account, it's a report of what happened. Now it's actually asking you to write a summary as well, so you're kind of just summing up the key things that you notice, but what's strange about this question is that you kind of have to summarise while also using quotations and making inferences as well. So it's a little bit misleading sometimes, that word summary, because when we summarise we just kind of say something in a much more concise way than what it's actually communicated in the extract, but it also wants you to make inferences as well, so we'll look into that in more detail as we get there, but it's just being really conscious that you know what is happening in both of them as you read. The next one, question 3, is language analysis, and it says you now need to look specifically at source B for this one, lines 20 to the end, so you might want to draw yourself a little box around yours when you get questions like this. How does the writer use language to show Mr. Terenzi's bravery? Now that one's worth 12 marks. So actually, if you have practiced some paper 1 questions, there is a language analysis question in that paper for 8 marks. This one's worth 12. The principle is the same. You're still analysing the impact of language and the imagery that comes with that. You're still using evidence and quotations. It's just worth more marks. You would spend around sort of 12 minutes on it. You don't really want to spend any more than sort of 15 minutes on that question, because question 4 tends to be the one that people struggle with the most. So let's just have a quick look at that one as well. You now need to refer to source A and B for this question. Again, that's the whole of source A and source B, but obviously just check those line numbers just to make doubly sure. It says compare how the 2 writers convey different attitudes towards being on a sinking ship. So when we're looking through the sources, we need to be thinking, what are they feeling? How do I know? What is their perspective on this particular moment? How do I know? So the major question you need to be asking yourself is, how do I know they feel that way? How do I know they have that idea? And that can be conveyed through methods such as imagery or repetition. And those are the kind of things that we need to be looking out for. And we need to be comparing the difference as well. So that one's worth 16 marks. Around 16 to 20 minutes on that question, certainly no more than 20. I would kind of see it as around a minute a mark for section A, but I wouldn't really kind of go too much over, because you want to make sure you've got your 45 minutes for section B. So just to be clear, around 4 minutes max on question 1, 8 to 10 on question 2, 12 to 15 on question 3, and 16 to 20 in question 4. Now as we look at question 5, again it says it right there, you're advised to spend 45 minutes on that question. The reason why I'm showing you this one really is because sometimes it can be thematically linked with what you read in the sources. but it's not the end of the world if you don't kind of look for this one immediately at the start. You can see in this case it's true. Survival skills should be a part of the school curriculum. Write a speech encouraging secondary school students to be hyper-vigilant during the summer holidays. So it's not necessarily about sinking ships, but it is about survival skills during the summer holidays. So there's this kind of tenuous link there. Now what we can do is have a read of both extracts with some of these questions in mind. So we've got source A here, and there's a little bit of context. It's a 21st century non-fiction blog called Surviving the Unthinkable. You've got the date there as well. Now it's worth noting that one source will always be sort of more modern and one will be a little older, 19th century. So this one's the more modern one, and it starts off with, "It was a serene morning when my friends and I embarked on a fishing trip off the beautiful shores of Sicily. Little did we know that this seemingly ordinary day would soon turn into a nightmare that tested our strength, courage and will to survive. This is the true account of my harrowing experience of surviving a boat sinking just off the coast of Sicily, and the lessons I learned in the face of adversity. As we set sail, the Mediterranean waters appeared calm and inviting. The sun's warm rays painted a picture of tranquility, and we were all excited about the prospects of a great catch. However, fate had other plans in store for us that day. Without warning, the boat jolted violently, and panic ensued as water started to flood the deck. We had collided with something hidden beneath the surface, and the boat was quickly sinking. Fear gripped us as we realised the severity of the situation. It was a race against time to save ourselves and the others on board. Amidst the chaos, I found myself taking charge of the situation. My instincts kicked in, and I knew that staying calm and composed was crucial to increasing our chances of survival. I urged everyone to put on life jackets and huddled them together, ensuring no one was left behind. As the boat vanished beneath the waves, we found ourselves stranded near the open sea on a small, desolate beach. The vastness of the ocean was daunting, and the uncertainty of rescue weighed heavily on our hearts. The initial hope we had clung to was now waning with every passing hour. Despite the dire circumstances, I refused to surrender to despair. I rationed our meagre supplies, ensuring we stayed hydrated and nourished. I shared stories, cracked jokes, and motivated my fellow survivors to hold on, reassuring them that help would eventually come. The day turned into night and the struggle continued. The scorching sun and the chilling winds took their toll, but I refused to give up. We had come so far, and the will to survive burned within me like a fierce flame. After what felt like an eternity, a cargo ship spotted our distress beacon. Relief washed over us as we saw the massive vessel approaching. The crew executed a daring rescue, pulling us to safety. The sense of triumph and gratitude at that moment was overwhelming. The experience of surviving a boat sinking has forever changed my perspective on life. It showed me the power of resilience and the strength that lies within us, waiting to be tapped into during our darkest moments. I learned that leadership can emerge from unexpected places, and that hope can be the lifeline that keeps us going. This journey taught me the importance of being prepared for the unexpected, valuing every moment and cherishing the gift of life. It is a reminder that even in the face of despair, the human spirit can endure and overcome. My survival was not a result of mere luck, but a testament to the indomitable will that resides in all of us. May this experience inspire others to find their strength in times of adversity, and to hold on to hope no matter how dire the circumstances may seem. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just mark off those line numbers for question 1. That was lines 1 to 10 for our true statements. And we're fine elsewhere because both questions 2 and 4 asked for the whole of source A and source B. And question 3 was on the language in source B. So we're good elsewhere. Now let's have a little look at some features that kind of stand out in terms of those questions that we're going to tackle shortly. Now don't forget, in question 2 we were being asked to consider purposes of both texts, and in question 4 we were being asked to consider the feelings of being on a sinking ship, the perspectives of being on a sinking ship and the attitudes. So let's just have a little look through. Now overall, obviously we can see that even though it was quite a traumatic experience for the writer, they clearly gained a lot from it. There was value in that moment that we learn by the end. So it starts off really quite serene, it's really, really beautiful. They're really excited to go out on this trip. We can see words like serene and beautiful. As we set sail, the waters were calm and inviting. Obviously, the writer does let us know that there is going to be something harrowing that they are going to convey to the reader, and the lessons that came with that in the first paragraph. So as we continue, it changes very, very suddenly in terms of tone. Really, really quickly, we go from tranquil, warm, serene, beautiful to fate had other plans. Without warning, the boat jolted violently. So you can see this really, really quick, really, really fast shift in tone, and that is a method that we need to be holding on to for later. There's words like jolted violently and panic ensued to really convey the sudden shock that the writer feels, along with that structural shift as well. And you'll notice things happen quite quickly as well. In the paragraph where without warning the boat does jolt, in that very same paragraph we see a sudden instinctual need to survive. It goes from amidst the chaos I find myself taking charge, my instincts kicked in. So there's this really, really sudden turn again because they know they have to. And it almost kind of starts to reveal the resilience that they actually mention towards the end of the extract too. You've got words and phrases like I urged everyone, huddled them together, despite the dire circumstances I refused to surrender, I rationed, I shared, reassured them. So there's this really sudden, again, shift, but this time it's all about determination. And again, in terms of purpose, we see that this is a real personal account. It's a real emotional journey. We've seen how the writer's agency really comes through in that particular moment there. As we continue further on, where we previously had the sun's warm rays and this idea of serenity, we've now got the scorching sun and the chilling winds. So again, it's this real visceral connection we've got there. We can really feel the kind of physical struggles as well as the emotional ones that have previously been conveyed as well. Then you've got this simile of burning within me like a fierce flame. So it's really important that we kind of hold on to methods like that because it really shows that resilience in terms of the writer's will to survive and the lesson that they wish to kind of impart on readers as well in terms of purpose once again. As we sort of continue to the end, there's almost this reflection back to that moment where it says the experience of surviving a boat has forever changed my perspective. It's encouraged resilience and an indomitable will. So it really, really shows the lesson that this person has gained. By the end, the writer hopes that their experience will inspire others to find their strength in times of adversity and to hold on no matter how dire the circumstances may seem. So we really become clear by the end the purpose of this is to encourage people to learn from their lesson as well. What we'll do is move on to source B, make some quick notes and then go into question 1. Okay, so with source B we've got a 19th century literary non-fiction extract taken from a booklet containing an eyewitness account of a shipwreck that occurred in Seaford in 1809. There's a couple of words for reference there that you might not have come across. They will often do this with words like that in your exam as well. It might not be every single one that you want, but there's certainly a few. So you've got the word billows, which are large sea waves. Habiliments is clothing, and then torpor is a state of physical or mental inactivity or tiredness. So it starts off, one of the 2 men that were preserved of this vessel had his nose cut asunder by the sudden fall of some timber upon him before he quit the ship, but his wound, though painful, turned out neither malignant nor dangerous. All of the distressed crews that could, by the most resolute efforts, be saved from the various vessels were saved before 10 o'clock in the morning, one only excepted, the preservation of whom is deserving of particular mention, and the following are the circumstances of it. The piteous spectacle of the wrecks was within a very short distance of Blatchington, and the commanding officer of the military there stationed, Captain Brown, and the greater part of the subordinates of the 81st Infantry, as well as the officers generally of that regiment, took very active and humane parts on the luckless situation. It so occurred that Mr. Terenzi, a lieutenant in the 81st, after various successful efforts in rescuing his fellow man from the brine of death, discovered a poor mariner in the last agonies of exhaustion, sometimes beneath and sometimes above the surface of the billows, feebly buffeting the waves, with a dying hope of being yet enabled of reaching the shore. The soul of the truly courageous but tender-hearted veteran was sensibly touched by the distressing picture of human woe that was now again exhibited before him, and he carefully watched every movement of the sufferer under the gratifying persuasion that the moment would arrive when he, by plunging in the water, should be able to afford him effectual relief. The drowning man, however, appeared to have expended the last effort he could command soon after Mr. Terenzi had discovered him, and at length, as resignant to the will of the all-good and all-powerful spirit of the universe, his eyes were raised on high, and the next moment he sunk as in the icy embrace of death. The feelings of Mr. Terenzi were now wrought up to the highest pitch of agony. "I'll save the poor fellow," he exclaimed, "or perish in the attempt," and instantly plunged into the foaming surges and was for some time lost to observation. His brave and noble character, however, was at length grasping firmly part of the habiliments of the object he had sought with one hand, while with the other he attempted to make good his return to the land. At this critical moment a heavy fragment of the wreck struck Mr. Terenzi on the temple. The blow was forcible, and deprived him of his senses. He could no longer strive to stem the current and regain the land, but still held the poor sailor in his grasp until lost, as it were, in the torpor of death, both sank together. Now we'll just have a quick look through to annotate any key ideas. Don't forget, for question 2 we're thinking about purpose comparatively to source A. For question 4 we're thinking about writers' feelings and perspectives conveyed through their language and structure. And then question 3, which is solely for source B this time, is language used from line 20 onwards to convey the bravery of Mr. Terenzi. So in terms of the kind of purpose of the text, we get a real sense that it's an eyewitness account, so it's really quite visibly more detached emotionally compared to source A. It's a outsider's view rather than a personal view, but we do get a sense of real admiration towards the end. Towards the end of the second paragraph is where we really get the idea that it's going to continue talking about one person and one person only. It says, "Someone who is deserving of particular mention, and the following are the circumstances of it." So from there onwards, lines 8 onwards, that's when we get a sense that this whole recount of this event is actually a focus solely on this one man who deserves this notable sort of mention. So the purpose there is to really spotlight the bravery of Mr. Terenzi. There's this sense of awe that's conveyed certainly through towards the end. You can see from lines 14 onwards in that paragraph there, Mr. Terenzi notices this man who is dying in the water. He's really, really at risk of drowning. There's words like feebly buffeting the waves, dying hope. He keeps kind of appearing above the surface of the water and then disappearing again. So that introduction kind of serves to show us as readers just how selfless Mr. Terenzi is. The fact that he sees that this person in such dire situation, in such danger, he then still proceeds to go and try to help him. Even in terms of structure there, the fact that it's focusing solely on him and his actions from here really serves to kind of prove just how much the writer is in awe of this man, Mr. Terenzi. It's almost a testament to his selflessness. So the whole focus from there onwards is his actions and how he deals with this man who's at risk of death. You've got words in this paragraph from line 20 onwards, such as courageous and plunging, to really, really show the bravery of Mr. Terenzi as well. So the idea of plunging being quite a powerful verb in the sense that you get this image of someone diving into something quite turbulent and quite powerful, which of course he is. The fact that he's plunging into this water shows this sense of immediacy, it's urgent. And I think, again, it shows his willingness. He isn't scared. He just doesn't think about it. He dives right in the face of danger. In the next paragraph, we learn that this drowning man sinks into the icy embrace of death. But even in the paragraph to follow, we see that Mr. Terenzi is so determined to save the poor fellow that he would even be willing to perish in the attempt to do so. And again, you've got that word plunged repeated to show that he is just not giving up. There's this unwavering courage, and actually quite a remarkable sacrifice as well with that word perish. The fact that he exclaims that, we look at that word exclaim, shows that determination, and we need to hold on to that for later. Now in the final paragraph, it's almost an honourable mention from the writer, really hones in on the absolute sacrifice given by Mr. Terenzi, the brave and noble character, those words there. And even in his dying moments too, as Mr. Terenzi also puts himself in this really dire situation where he's hit on the head, he does not let go of the poor sailor. He holds him in his grasp, and it's really quite resolute. There's this real willingness, this determination, even in death, by Mr. Terenzi, and it ends on quite a profound and solemn note that they both sank together, almost this quiet, solemn feeling in terms of the respect that we should convey to this brave man. Now what we'll do is head into the questions now that we've read these and made a few brief notes. Okay, so in question 1, we are asked to read source A from lines 1 to 10 and choose 4 statements from below which are true. And we've got 4 marks for this, so we know we need to choose 4. We don't want to spend any more than 4 minutes on this question because it's a nice way to sort of make up your time for later. We do not want to spend ages on this one. It's the smallest in terms of marks that you can gain, so we'll make it nice and quick. So the first, it says, when the men left the shore, it was bad weather. Second, the men were out on a fishing trip. C, the men could not sense any impending disasters. D, the blogger believes his experience was inspiring. E, the blogger learnt life lessons because of the disaster. F, the Mediterranean waters were particularly choppy that day. G, it was cold when they left the shore. And H, the men expected to catch a lot of fish that evening. Now you'll notice I read all of them first, and I think that's important because you want to make sure you're weighing up your options of yes, this is true, no, that one's definitely not true. So read them all first because you don't just want to go down one by one and then realise, oh, actually, maybe H is the right one, but I've already picked my 4. So make sure you read them all first. Let's have a look through now that we have, and we'll whittle them down. The first one says, when the men left the shore, it was bad weather. Now, you'll remember when we were reading it, I told you it was warm, it was sunny, and it was a shock when everything went wrong because it was so serene and beautiful there. It says the sun's warm rays. So no, the weather was not bad. It was very lovely and tranquil. B, the men were out on a fishing trip. Yes, literally the first line says I embarked on a fishing trip. C, the men could not sense any impending disasters. They had no idea what was to come. That's why it was such a shock. So C is absolutely true. They could not sense any issue. D, the blogger believes his experience was inspiring. Now, we do get a sense of that later on. However, it does not mention anything of the sort in the first 2 paragraphs. It does say lessons were learned, but it doesn't say that it was inspiring. So if we go on to E, the blogger learnt life lessons because of the disaster, we can say yes, that one is true because the words are the lessons I learned. So yes, they learn lessons, but it wasn't necessarily a story of inspiration. F, the Mediterranean waters were particularly choppy that day. No, there was no note of it kind of being dangerous or treacherous. It says it was serene and tranquil. Again, G, it was cold when they left the shore. No, it said it was warm. And then H, the men expected to catch a lot of fish that evening. That one is true. It says they were all excited at the prospect of a great catch. You'll have seen with D and E, that was probably the bit where you got a little bit confused. This is why it's really important to read them all first, because we decided that E was the more suitable one when compared with D, and obviously you can only choose 4. So that's where I would recommend just being really careful, because there's always a sneaky one where you've got to be a little bit more careful as well. So let's just check on the next slide that we've got our 4 marks. Okay, so there are your 4 true statements. B, the men were out on a fishing trip. C, the men could not sense any impending disasters. E, the blogger learnt life lessons because of the disaster. And H, the men expected to catch a lot of fish that evening. So that's an easy 4 marks. Again, top tip with that one is just read them first, reason with yourself why that one is true, and then tick your answers as you select them. The last thing I want to say is that in the paper itself, they can be quite specific about the instructions they require from you in terms of how to mark it off as true. Sometimes it might ask you to tick boxes in some exams, for example, but typically in this one there's a little circle where you colour in the circle inside a box. It's very specific, so just make sure you read the instructions just to make sure you're really getting it right for those marks. Now we're on to question 2, and this one is worth 8 marks, 8 to 10 minutes. Let's have a look. You now need to refer to source A and source B. Use details from both sources to write a summary of the differences in the purposes of the 2 texts. So we're summarising the purposes, the purpose being what does the writer want to achieve. Now, let's quickly just go through the mark scheme and we'll look at level 4. Essentially, what it asks you to do is demonstrate insightful synthesis and analysis of both texts for 7 to 8 marks. And to do that, you need to hit these 3 bullet points. Draws insightful inferences from both pieces. So that's what I was talking about before. When you infer, you think what is suggested by what you have read. So it's a little bit more than a summary, which is where the wording can catch you out a little bit sometimes. You're thinking, oh, I've got this evidence that helps to summarise, but what does it suggest? The next one says chooses relevant references and textual details pertinent to the question's focus. So you're using evidence to help you to summarise that is based on what the question is asking of you. You're sticking to your question and you're proving that question as well with your evidence ultimately. And then third, highlights discerning differences between the texts. The question says a summary of the differences, so you need to identify the differences between them through comparison. The way that I like to imagine this as a general kind of structure is to make a point, evidence it with a quote and then an inference, and then do the same for the other text. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you have to do 3 separate sentences, because it can be really effective and look really, really great for your writing in terms of how you communicate your ideas to embed quotations in your topic sentences as well. So you can embed quotations and really, really practice that before your exam. It's just a way of making sure that you're hitting what you need to, because you're making your point about the difference in the purpose in your point. You're using a quotation to hit that second bullet point, and then the inference hits that bullet point there where it says draws insightful inferences from the texts. So long as you do that with one text and then do it again with another, you are hitting that mark scheme. But don't necessarily see that as a paragraph structure, just see it as a way to structure your ideas to make sure you're hitting the mark scheme. So what we'll do is go on to the next slide and just start planning out our response before we put it together into a full written response that we'll then mark. Right, let's get straight into planning. I do think it's worth just kind of gathering your thoughts on this question. However, you only want to be spending 8 to 10 minutes, no more than 10, on it, just to really maximise your marks later on in the exam too. So we might just kind of really quickly gather our thoughts, make some brief notes, and that's why it helps to do so as you're kind of reading it as well. So in your kind of opening, it's always worth doing a brief kind of summary that captures the essence of the general piece. And we kind of did that while we were reading, didn't we? We said that the first text was kind of a personal narrative. It's quite emotional in terms of the lessons learned from individual kind of resilience and the idea of hope in such a dangerous and life-threatening situation. And then in source B, it was still emotive, but much more from a distant perspective. It was an outsider's perspective. It was recounting the events of Mr. Gerenzi and his self-sacrifice, really spotlighting him and his actions as well. So we'll do ourselves a little table and we'll start with source A. And the writer's purpose is quite evident quite quickly, because we see the writer taking on this kind of leadership role immediately as they recognise the boat is sinking. So We've got stuff like I urged everyone and my instincts kicked in and I refused to surrender. There's lots and lots of phrases that emphasise the kind of determination to make a difference in such a scary situation. And the writer doesn't just want to kind of convey the emotion there, but there's also kind of physical struggles as well. So we've got phrases like scorching sun and chilling winds, creating this kind of visceral feeling of pain for readers in terms of the real experience and the harrowing experience of these individuals that have been caught up in this situation. So the purpose there becomes more about inviting us to really understand it through that visceral connection as well. Now, as we look at source B, the purpose is to recount a maritime disaster and again spotlight Mr. Derenzi's kind of efforts. We get this sense that he is resolute and determined, even in the face of danger. He sees this drowning man in the last agonies of exhaustion and still is determined to kind of deal with this man and sacrifice himself for this man as well. The decision to plunge into the water as well builds on that, and the use of the word plunge from the writer conveys that kind of purpose as well, to spotlight Mr. Derenzi's kind of heroism there. There's a bit towards the end where Mr. Derenzi sustains a severe blow to his temple, and even in that situation he still doesn't let go of the man. So that again links to the purpose, because he's completely selfless in his sacrifice of himself for this man. So if the purpose is all about spotlighting Mr. Derenzi's actions, it does so in terms of consistently describing the ways in which he does not give up trying to save the man. So we've got a brief picture there, and you'll notice that when I was speaking it was very kind of summative. I'm summarising because that's what the question wants me to do. So it felt like I was retelling the story. That's good, because that's what it needs to look like. Now we'll move on and have a look and then mark it off. Okay, so the answer starts off with, in summary, the first text is a personal narrative that recounts a boat sinking experience and the lessons learned from it, focusing on individual resilience and the power of hope. The second text is a more detached account of a maritime disaster, highlighting the heroic actions of Mr. Derenzi and his self-sacrifice to save lives. So what that really does quite nicely is just captures the general sort of feel for the two texts in a really summative way. And again, this is a summary, so you want to kind of capture that as best as you can in the time that you're allowed. Obviously that's not quite enough in terms of your 8 marks, because that's quite simple at the moment. Don't forget we need inference and evidence as well. So this is where these 2 paragraphs to follow come in, and they're really important for upping the marks. It says, in source A, the writer's purpose becomes evident as they take on a leadership role amidst a crisis, emphasising the importance of staying calm and composed. This shows the writer's intent to inspire and impart lessons from their experience. Phrases like, I urged everyone, my instincts kicked in, and I refused to surrender to despair emphasise the writer's agency and determination to make a positive difference in the dire circumstances. The narrative also uses vivid descriptions to showcase the physical and emotional struggles the survivors face. For instance, phrases like scorching sun, chilling winds, and overwhelming relief create a visceral connection with readers, inviting them to imagine themselves in the midst of the harrowing circumstances. Now, obviously, at the moment with the introduction, we're kind of at level 1. We've established that the question's being answered. But in that paragraph there, you can really get a sense that summary and inference is happening. We've got the summary of the leadership role that the writer takes on, and how this is conveyed through phrases like, I urged everyone and my instincts kicked in, and so on. The inference there is where it emphasises the writer's agency and determination to make a difference. Now that for me is a level 3 comment. It's clear. It's a clear inference. When we're at level 3, we're clear. It kind of goes basic in level 1. There's some efforts in level 2, it's clear in level 3, and then it's really perceptive and thoughtful by the time we get to level 4. Those really original ideas. Now that there is clear, because they've clearly understood the idea that those quotations emphasise the determination, and it's very sudden as well, that shift. Then it goes on to say that the narrative uses vivid descriptions with stuff like scorching sun and chilling winds. Now, I want to be clear here, you're not analysing language. This is a summary question. So where we're talking about vivid descriptions, you've got to be careful not to analyse language too much, but because this question is about the writer's purpose, the writer's purpose is conveyed through vivid description. So for this particular question, this is where it can maybe be a little bit tricky in terms of avoiding analysing language too much, because you're going to save that for question 3. So just be careful, because it says vivid description, but then it gives the evidence and then it just gives an inference. It doesn't zoom in on any of those words like you would when you're analysing language. So just be careful with that. Now, here it actually hits level 4 because the perceptive comment, it creates a visceral connection with readers, inviting them to imagine themselves in the midst of the harrowing circumstances. That's level 4 in terms of it being a really thoughtful and original comment to make, like what we were just saying. If we're thinking about the writer's purpose, the purpose is obviously to inspire people into seeing that there is hope in these dire situations. This is where it starts to take place, because we've got that visceral connection with readers, understanding that it was a really terrifying situation and the writer's purpose is clear there, showing how terrifying that situation was, but still being resolute in their efforts despite that. So that's really perceptive to pick up on that as a candidate in this exam. So that's a level 4 comment. Now, you have to be careful because obviously it's a comparison, and if you only talk about one text, you will only hit level 2 no matter how amazing that paragraph is. So yes, that's a level 4 comment to make, but actually unless we compare to the other source, then we're capped at level 2 anyway, because the question asks you to talk about both. So this is where this next paragraph comes in. And it says, whereas in source B, the purpose of the second text is to recount a maritime disaster and spotlight the heroic actions of Mr. de Renzi during the rescue efforts. This purpose is evident through the text's meticulous detailing of Mr. de Renzi's efforts to save lives. His repeated and resolute attempts to rescue mariners struggling in the water highlight his exceptional bravery, and the narrative's emphasis on the last agonies of exhaustion conveys the dire nature of the situation, intensifying the impact of his actions. The description of his deliberate decision to plunge into the water to assist a drowning sailor showcases his remarkable sense of duty and willingness to put others' lives before his own. The pivotal moment where Mr. de Renzi sustains a severe blow to his temple while holding on to the sailor reflects the text's underlying theme of selflessness and sacrifice, linking back to the purpose. Now we've got a comment on the difference there with the word whereas. That sentence considers that there is a difference, but it doesn't really kind of go any further than that in terms of differences. It then just kind of focuses on the text. So in terms of difference, we've got obviously what was mentioned in the very first paragraph, that kind of introduction, and then just briefly there. So at the moment we could only really put that into a level 2 kind of difference, but we have talked about both texts, so we can get above that overall. Now it says, this purpose is evident through the text's meticulous detailing of Mr. de Renzi's efforts to save lives. That's a appropriate textual reference. Don't forget, we don't have to necessarily use quotations. That refers to the text. It kind of summarises the text. And we've got repeated and resolute attempts to rescue mariners struggling in the water highlights his bravery. Now, that there again kind of goes back to the purpose, in the sense that it's all about spotlighting Mr. de Renzi's efforts and the fact that he's done it before as well. It's not his first time attempting something like this. He's done it before. He's risked his life many times before, so he's deserving of such a review. And what this response captures really well here is the purpose. The purpose is all about spotlighting Mr. de Renzi, and the response picks up on the fact that that is done through the description of deliberate decision to plunge in the water. The fact that the writer has deliberately described that shows his remarkable sense of duty. That's Mr. de Renzi. So the purpose is all about spotlighting him, and again, using language like plunge shows that fearlessness, that effort, that drive for readers, so we can really see what the writer's trying to do, really spotlight this man. I know I keep saying spotlight. The last bit again links back to the purpose, because we've got this idea of Mr. de Renzi getting this severe blow to his temple and still holds onto the sailor despite that. and it reflects the text's underlying theme of selflessness and sacrifice. And the response says it links back to the purpose, and don't forget the purpose is all about showing Mr. Terenzi's bravery. So again, it does that through that inference. It's inferred from the text that it's all about the sacrifice of this man. It's a perceptive comment, so that can be level 4. Now, ultimately, the only thing that was kind of lacking here was not the evidence, was not the inference, but the comparison. So we'll look at the next slide for the mark scheme to decide on a final mark, but that was the one thing that maybe could have been a little bit more carefully crafted. Okay, so let's have a look at the mark scheme then. Because we know we've hit level 4, we are in level 4, and because we know we've compared, we are definitely in level 4. If we'd only done a really good paragraph on source A, we would be capped no matter how good it is. But we know that we've talked about both, so we're safe there. We know we've already hit the level 4 skills in one place or another, and you do only have to hit it once, so long as you have talked about both. So we've got draws insightful inferences from both pieces. Yes, we found inferences from both, and there were level 4 in both, so we can tick that one. We can choose relevant references and textual details pertinent to the question's focus. Yes, we kept going back to the purpose, whether that was through implicit kind of explanations or explicit explanations. We do talk about the purpose for both. And then the third bullet point says highlights discerning differences between the texts. As I said, that was probably the only one that was lacking really. We've got that whereas comment and we've got that first bit in the introduction, but that was probably the thing that was missing, maybe just going back with some comparative connectives throughout our paragraphs, just to make it really clear that we can see the difference in purpose. So in total, we can get 7 out of 8 marks for that response. So we're looking at question 3 now, and we are looking at lines 20 to the end. Don't forget, we are focusing on those line numbers only. You must not take quotations from anywhere else in the text. Make sure you get those marks. Don't waste your time talking about something you're not going to get marked for. The question asks us to focus on the language that conveys Mr. Terenzi's bravery. And that language is anything essentially that creates images for the reader. Now it's worth 12 marks, 12 to 15 minutes, no more than that, because we want to make sure that we're really maximising our time. We've got bigger questions to tackle still. So 12 to 15 minutes. Now we're looking at level 4 because that's always where we want to aim for. We've got overall, our aim is to demonstrate an in-depth and insightful comprehension of language. So in-depth being really zooming in on that language that we've got, really picking it apart carefully and making sure we understand it with that word comprehension. So our first bullet point says, examines the effects of the writer's language choices. Examines means to really closely analyse and explore that language choice. So that could be through a simile that is used, that could be through repetition, that could be a series of really interesting adjectives, or even an exclamatory sentence, for example. Anything that allows you to see Mr. Terenzi's bravery and almost the praise of that bravery as well is really key, because don't forget, we know that the writer's in awe of the efforts of Mr. Terenzi. Now, the third bullet point says utilises advanced and precise subject-specific terminology. So that's picking out features that you know. Now the second bullet point says chooses a thoughtful assortment of textual details. So that's just you carefully choosing your quotations to prove your points. Keeping them nice and concise so you've got a little to zoom in for a lot of analysis. And that is what gets you the marks, really closely examining rather than giving yourself too much to do. And your third bullet point says utilises advanced and precise subject-specific terminology. So that's just naming the methods that you can spot to support your analysis. Essentially just naming the features that you can see. Simile, adjective, verb, noun, all of that stuff. You want to be really showing off what you know here. So just drop them in. Now that doesn't mean necessarily just throwing in everything that you see because you think that you should to get the marks. It's identifying quotations that have those features and just focusing on those ones really closely, examining those ones really closely. You don't want to pick out tons and tons of features and only broadly talk about every single one of them. You want to pick out a few features and really closely talk about those ones specifically. Because if you're in depth, that's what's going to get you into level 4. It says it right there. Okay, so what we'll do is put together a brief plan just to help us to form our ideas ready for the response. Now, we're aiming for about sort of 3 paragraphs. That doesn't necessarily mean 3 quotations, but if we want to be really, really concise with our kind of analysis, we might choose kind of 3 points, certainly. And then we can use a series of kind of short quotations to prove that point. But we want to make sure that we're being really, really analytical with the ones that we do choose. So I want to start off with the quotation, don't forget we're looking at lines 20 to the end, plunging in the water, because this is the real kind of first undoubtable sign of bravery that we have. There's a real visible sign of willingness to directly confront the danger there. There's no hesitation in that word plunged. And I really want us to zoom in on that word plunged as well. It is repeated a few times too, so I definitely think it's worth zooming in on. And when we think about that word, we've got to think about the images again that it conjures for readers. And for me, I imagine someone diving into something with a real sense of purpose. If you plunge into something, there's no hesitation, there's no kind of consideration of it. You're doing it, and you're doing it without kind of any delay. The fact it's repeated as well emphasises the deliberate and impactful nature of his actions. It's urgent, it's immediate, he's not wasting his time. And if we're thinking about the symbolism of the idea of something being plunged into something else, or him plunging into the water, for me, again, it kind of allows me to imagine the act of actually diving headfirst into a situation. It's symbolic of his willingness to dive headfirst into perilous situations. He's done it before as well, so it really, really accentuates that point that was raised about the fact that it's not the first time he's done this. And obviously that's just analysis from one word, and this is what I mean about saying that you carefully need to choose your quotations, because you want to be sure that what you are choosing gives you something really juicy to talk about, something really perceptive to talk about. You can really go to town with that quotation or that word or that method. This bit I would like to look at is the bit where he announces that he wants to save the poor fellow. He exclaims, and then he says, "Or I'll perish in the attempt." It's a really profound statement to make. And if we're thinking about bravery, it really highlights his absolute unrelenting, unwavering willingness to do what he has to do, or do what he can to save this man. And even though there's this kind of sense of acceptance that he may perish in the attempt, that doesn't stop him. So I will do this or I'll perish. Like, there's this real willingness. He confronts the worst possible situation without even hesitating. He's just accepting of it, but not in a defeatist kind of way. In a way where he says, I'm going to do this regardless. So I think it's really worth zooming in on that to prove his bravery once again. The use of that word I will save the poor fellow. There's this sense of ownership there. He's really claiming that as his own duty to do. And then that paired with the phrase poor fellow kind of conveys his empathy, which makes us respect him even more and respect his bravery even more, because it's not just about his physical efforts, the fact that he does plunge himself into that situation, but also that he absolutely cares about supporting who he can support. So it's a really, really good one again for picking apart lots of different things within that quotation. And then finally, just towards the end, where we've got this real sort of complementary range of vocabulary from the writer to really, really show his awe and respect and reverence for Mr. de Renzi. We've got the words, or the phrases, truly courageous, we've got brave, we've got noble character. And I think even with that first one, especially that word truly, really adds this kind of layer of almost truth and authenticity. His courage is consistent. It's not something that's just a one-off situation. He's done this before, and it sets him apart from anyone who's tried to save anyone before. It's a regular thing for him. It's consistent. And again, if you pair it with that word noble, being noble isn't just about being brave. it's about moral purpose and virtue as well. So there's a real reverence for this man, and it's shown through those words, and it really conveys his bravery, because it's not just physical effort, it's not just about being sort of brave in that moment. Clearly it's repeated, clearly it's about his personality, clearly it's a part of his identity. So there's more to him than meets the eye in this particular moment. There's more depth to this character, and it makes him all the more brave and deserving of this sort of accolade, I suppose. Now, we've looked at quotations that almost prove him to be this really layered character. So we're going to put this all together and we'll have a look at how it comes together on the next slide. Okay, so it starts off with, overall, the writer crafts a narrative that employs language to portray Mr. Terenzi as a courageous and selfless individual. The narrative includes phrases like plunging in the water, plunged into the foaming surges, and attempted to make good his return to the land, accentuates Mr. Terenzi's bravery and his willingness to directly confront danger in the face of adversity. This repetition not only emphasises the physical action he takes, but also reinforces the mental and emotional fortitude behind his choices. The adjective plunged conjures images of someone diving into turbulent waters with a sense of purpose. Its repetition emphasises the deliberate and impactful nature of Mr. Terenzi's actions, creating a sense of urgency and immediacy. The act of plunging into the water is symbolic of Mr. Terenzi's willingness to dive headfirst into a perilous situation. This symbolism conveys his fearlessness and determination, showcasing his ability to confront challenges head-on regardless of the risks involved. Now, in that first paragraph alone, you can really see this ladder approach in terms of how the response hits and conforms to a mark scheme. So we've got, quite early on, some attempt to analyse language. Now, don't forget, I said level 2 is kind of trying, but it's not quite there, or it's missing something. Got the bit where it says that the repetition emphasises the action he takes, but reinforces the emotional kind of fortitude and strength ultimately behind his choices. So that's an attempt, but we want to zoom in a little bit more closely on that at the moment. So there's some attempt, but I'm thinking as an examiner, they could say a little bit more, and that's where it does it next. So it says the adjective plunged conjures images of someone diving into turbulent waters, and this is what I was saying about how we need to consider language and the images it conjures or produces in readers' heads, because that's what language should do, allow us to picture something, and this is what it allows us to picture. And he's dived in with a sense of purpose. So I can see that in my head, the fact he's plunged in, there's no hesitation, it's deliberate and it's impactful, and it creates a sense of urgency and immediacy. So now that is clear because they've zoomed in and they've made it clear the image that they can see because of that word plunged. So we can put it at level 3 analysis. The bit that puts it into level 4 is the bit about the symbolism. When you're thinking about symbolism, you're thinking, what is the bigger picture here? Yes, he's done this, he's jumped into the water, but what does it represent about him on a much grander scale? And it represents the fact that he will dive headfirst into perilous situations, not just this one, but many others. He can confront challenges head on, regardless of the risks, and it says that in that final sentence there. That's a really perceptive comment to make, and by perceptive, I mean it's really thoughtful. It shows that this response doesn't just consider the kind of basic, in the moment kind of things that we see, it considers much deeper that this person is consistently brave. And that's why they're deserving of such reverence from this writer. Now, as we go further, it says, furthermore, the writer shows Mr. Terenzi's determination to save the drowning sailor, even after being struck on the temple by debris, showcases remarkable sacrifice and perseverance. The exclamation, "I'll save the poor fellow or perish in the attempt," is a profound statement that highlights Mr. Terenzi's exceptional resolve and unwavering courage. The phrase, "or perish in the attempt," illustrates Mr. Terenzi's fearlessness in the face of danger. He's not just willing to face adversity, he's prepared to confront the worst possible outcome without hesitation. The use of the term "poor fellow" conveys his empathy and sense of responsibility towards others suffering. This indicates that his bravery is not just a display of physical prowess, but a reflection of his caring nature. Now in this bit you've got more reference to subject terminology. Obviously we had that above with the symbolism and the repetition and the mention of phrases, but we've got the exclamation because the character exclaims. And you've got this really nice consideration that this quotation almost proves that Mr. Terenzi doesn't just face adversity, he confronts the worst possible outcome because that might actually happen. He recognises that might actually happen, and he still doesn't let that stop him, and that in itself is something to be applauded by this writer. This paragraph recognises that, and it's really effective for doing so. It then zooms in a little bit further with the phrase poor fellow and how that shows a sense of responsibility. There's this real empathy from Mr. Terenzi, and again that's something that should be applauded in terms of bravery. It shows he's not just brave but also really, really empathetic and caring. So you can see that actually again each part of that quotation's been carefully analysed. You've got the bit about the exclamation, you've got a bit about perishing in the attempt, you've got poor fellow, and it's really, really cleverly chosen, its quotation, so it's really, really good for that in that paragraph in terms of careful selection of quotes, because that's really important for you to be looking out for as well. Finally, the writer deliberately chooses intensely positive adjectives to describe Mr. Terenzi, such as truly courageous, noble character and brave, to emphasise and deepen the depiction of Mr. Terenzi's courageous nature. The word truly adds a layer of authenticity, suggesting that his courage is consistent, deeply ingrained and genuine, setting him apart as someone who consistently exhibits valour even in the face of adversity. Noble implies not just physical bravery but also a sense of moral integrity and virtue. The repeated use of such adjectives reinforces the notion that Mr. Terenzi's courage is not a fleeting or isolated act, it's a fundamental part of his identity. This consistency adds depth to his character, making him more relatable and compelling. In essence, the writer creates a multifaceted image of Mr. Terenzi as a brave, selfless and heroic individual. These elements highlight his fearlessness, determination, empathy and willingness to endure personal hardship for the greater good, showcasing his bravery throughout. Now again, there's some really thoughtful analysis in the sense that it doesn't just zoom in on one of those, it looks at truly, looks at brave, considers those pairings that we were talking about when we were planning. What makes this really perceptive is that the response considers the fact that Mr. Terenzi isn't just this kind of single layer character. There's more to him. His identity is centred around his kind of selflessness. It's not just something that's isolated, it's actually a part of him, and I think that's a really, really lovely and thoughtful comment to make. So it really solidifies that level 4 and then just rounds it all off at the end with that conclusion of him being multifaceted. He's fearless, he's determined, he's empathetic, he's willing, and he does all of that for the greater good, which ultimately showcases his bravery. So it really rounds up the answer and it's focused on the question as well. Now, in terms of carefully chosen quotations, focus on methods and terminology, focus on really thoughtful comments, we've really, really nailed it for this one. So we'll just have a quick look back over the mark scheme to confirm what our mark is as usual. Looking at the mark scheme then, we're looking at level 4 because we know we've hit features of level 4. That was displayed when we were marking it. Demonstrates in-depth and insightful comprehension of language through examining the effects of the writer's language choices. We can tick that one because we know there were some really thoughtful comments made, some really thoughtful analysis as well. So definitely that one. Chooses a thoughtful assortment of textual details. Yes, we've got a real range of quotations used. Really, really good in the sense that it picks them apart. It makes lots and lots of comments on one piece of evidence. That's a really, really lovely skill to have and one that you guys should practice. And then the third utilises advanced and precise subject-specific terminology. Again, yes, there was a range of terminology identified with the quotations chosen, and they were again really, really concisely analysed too. So for this one, 12 out of 12. Okay, so we're up to the big question of the reading section. It's worth 16 marks and you want to spend about 16 to 20 minutes, absolutely no more than 20 minutes on it. So I just want to go through the mark scheme to show you essentially what you're aiming for, because this one especially is one that people tend to struggle with. It's typically poorly examined, so we need to know what we're aiming for so you don't forget to do a particular element or kind of add in a particular element for your paragraphs and your analysis. So you're being asked to consider the attitudes in both texts towards being on a sinking ship. So you're comparing the methods, and you're supporting ideas with references to both texts. So those are the key things we need to remember. Now, in the mark scheme, it says, overall, you're comparing ideas and viewpoints insightfully to be in level 4 by examining the methods employed by the writers. So this is really important because this is the how. How are those feelings conveyed? And that's the most important one out of all of those three. I think it's the one that people typically forget in this question. It's the thing that people are sort of poorly marked on all the time. So it's important you're always asking yourself, how are those feelings put across? That big keyword, how. The next one says, chooses a thoughtful assortment of supporting details from both pieces. So that's just your evidence. And you'll see there that it says both pieces, and that's really, really important because this is a comparison question. You need evidence from both to show how they are feeling. Methods come into that, and obviously quotations come into proving it as well. You need your evidence, and you need to prove how that evidence conveys that emotion or perspective. So if you look a bit further down, at level 2, for example, this second bullet point about quotations actually says chooses a few relevant textual details not consistently supportive from one or both pieces. Now you'll see there that it allows you to just talk about one, but you will be capped at level 2 if you do not talk about both of the extracts. So you could write an incredible piece of analysis about how one of the writer's perspectives are conveyed, but if you don't talk about 2, you will be capped at level 2. So this is a comparison, and to be up in level 3 and level 4, you need to make sure that you're actually comparing. And finally, the third bullet point says demonstrates a deep and discerning understanding of the varied ideas and perspectives present in both texts. So ultimately, that's just you showing your understanding of how those feelings are conveyed in both. So you're really, really sort of explaining in depth. Perhaps there is a verb that really conveys some kind of anger or frustration at the situation that they're in, and you're really, really zooming in on that and showing based on that piece of evidence and then another piece of evidence as well. So there's a building argument almost, and that proves a deep understanding of the varied ideas, because then it could be that it changes to a much more positive tone by the end because there's a real sudden shift in tone. So you're really, really showing a varied understanding and how it switches, or if it stays the same in one but switches in the other. So it's really, really looking closely and covering as much ground as you can ultimately. So to summarise, I would ask myself 3 questions. What's their mood? What's the evidence that proves that? And what methods within that evidence prove it even further? And then you compare. So there's almost 4 components to it. And like I said, people always seem to forget the methods. So don't forget that third component. You're thinking, what's the mood? What's the evidence? What methods prove it? And then you compare to make sure that you're hitting all of those bullet points and covering both. Okay, so we're going to plan this question by drawing ourselves a table, and I would recommend doing this in your exam by keeping it quite short, obviously, but it is important because we need to identify some differences and we need to know where our argument is going. So we'll start off with source A, and don't forget with source A, it was a sort of emotional journey where initially they're going out on a fishing trip, absolutely no problems, and then suddenly, and very, very suddenly in fact, they encountered trouble and danger. And by the end, there's this kind of lesson of triumph, hope, resilience, and will. And it really kind of underscores human endurance, I suppose. So it's really, really important that we kind of capture the varying emotions that the writer highlights and exposes to us. And I would say there's 3 big ideas that we need to kind of look at there. So it's important that we start off with the tranquility that's initially conveyed, because that tranquility then contrasted with that sudden shock is what really, really kind of highlights the sudden fear and sudden need for plan and resilience that they face together and that the writer has to kind of absorb. So our method is going to be the shift in tone. This is a structural feature. We can talk about structure as well as kind of language choices. And we will talk about the tranquility contrasted with phrases such as jolted violently, panic ensued, because it happens so quickly and we really want to talk about that. It really, really exposes the kind of suddenness of the crisis and therefore the emotional turmoil that's kind of captured through that sudden shock as well. And if you remember, we said earlier that there's another sudden shift as well, because the writer recognises that they have to be proactive and determined and kind of engage in some form of leadership. So there's quotations and phrases like urge everyone, huddle them together, instincts kicked in, and all of that, which then kind of shows this sudden resilience. And we want to be looking at those phrases. It kind of, in terms of perspectives, highlights the attitude that the writer faces in terms of having to face things head on and being proactive in striving for survival. And then again, sort of reflecting back on the event, we see the triumph that the writer feels. There's this real sense of triumph from the writer, and it focuses on the sort of power of resilience as a quotation, indomitable will as well of humans, and it really shows the writer's belief that humans can really withstand troubling, awful circumstances. And throughout it, don't forget, the mark scheme asks us to consider a range of varied perspectives throughout both texts. And if you think about it, we've gone from absolute tranquility to sudden shock and panic, to then realising that they've got to do something to face this challenge, and then a sense of triumph by the end. So in terms of encompassing all of those emotions, it's really important that we do that to really capitalise on those marks. And if you look, we're thinking about what is their mood, what is their attitude, what is their viewpoint, what is their perspective. We've got the evidence planned out, and we've got the methods in terms of shift in tone, phrases and words, and we'll really, really make sure that we consider the use of language and the use of structure to really hit that mark scheme in terms of methods, because that's the one that people miss. And obviously now we have to compare, so we'll look at source B as well. Now don't forget, source B is less about the narrator's emotional journey, because obviously this narrator is just recounting events as an eyewitness account, and it's more about broader picture of heroism in the face of danger. So yes, in source A, the writer themselves, the hero, they were the ones that were supporting others, whereas this one is actually applauding another hero. So we've already got a difference there. Now, as we look specifically at some of the language used, consistently there is really reverent language, and we really want to focus on that. Stuff like courageous attempts, ultimate sacrifice. There's a real focus on the admiration from the writer, and we want to talk about that perspective. It's clearly admirable from the writer's perspective what Mr. de Renzi has done. So those phrases consistently throughout the piece of writing show Mr. de Renzi's unwavering kind of determination, what we spoke about in question 3, and the fact that the writer consistently focuses on praise serves as this almost kind of testament to his selflessness. I believe we said that earlier on. There's also language used that really conveys the kind of dire circumstances faced by the drowning man as well, the mariner. So we've got words like poor mariner, last agonies of exhaustion, he's feebly buffeting the waves. So the fact that the writer emphasises that and then switches to Mr. de Renzi's kind of attempts to rescue him not only highlights the urgency of the situation, but shows that Mr. de Renzi feels this sense of duty, and it's kind of natural to him, it's innate. He doesn't think about it, it's just what he knows he should do. So again, in terms of writer's perspective, it's shown through that kind of switch between this man's in trouble to this is what Mr. de Renzi does without even kind of thinking about it. It shows just how brave Mr. de Renzi is through that shift from the writer again. That idea of empathy is then sort of furthered with that phrase, dying hope of being yet enabled of reaching the shore. That's the mariner who's drowning. He's clearly desperately struggling for survival, and that does not stop Mr. de Renzi's intervention. He knows it's important, he knows it's crucial, he knows it's critical, and the fact that it really showcases that and really, really showcases the critical situation that this mariner is in. Again, underscores just how much Mr. Terenzi is deserving of reverence, and the whole way through, whether it's through language that actually explicitly describes Mr. Terenzi or describes the situation that the mariner is in, it all goes back to reverence for the selflessness and emphasis of that selflessness because of the dire situation that he puts himself into to make sure that someone else isn't suffering. Obviously, by the end, both of them are unfortunate, but that in itself is praised by the writer because the man, Mr. Terenzi, does not give in regardless of putting himself at risk of perishing. Now you'll see there I've deliberately focused on shifts in tone and writers deliberately focusing on certain elements of description or characters. That's just as important as zooming in on words like you did in question 3. So don't think you can't think structure. You've done it in paper 1 with question 3 there. Those are still methods, and I wanted to place real emphasis on that. So let's see how it comes together in the next response. So here is part of the response. We've got the sort of introduction and then covering source A just on this screen, and on the next slide we've got covering source B. So we'll mark it as we go, just so you get a general picture by the end or by the next slide where we are in terms of marks. So it says, while both texts involve the harrowing experience of a ship sinking, they approach the subject with varying tones and attitudes. In the first text, the writer's attitude is characterised by a sense of personal involvement and reflection. On the other hand, the second text adopts a more detached and objective approach, focusing on the heroic actions of Mr. Terenzi and the overall rescue efforts. In the first text, the writer's attitude towards the sinking ship is deeply rooted in the emotional journey of the narrator and the transformative experience of facing a life-threatening situation. The narrative commences with a serene and idyllic backdrop, evoking a sense of tranquility. This initial setting creates a stark contrast with the sudden upheaval that follows. The shift in tone from tranquility to chaos serves as a powerful literary device that accentuates the abruptness and shocking nature of the event. The writer's shock and disbelief are palpable through their choice of words and the evolution of the narrative tone. Phrases like jolted violently and panic ensued underscore the suddenness of the crisis, while the description of water flooding the deck adds a sense of immediacy and urgency. The writer's use of language here not only describes the physical events but also provides insight into the emotional turmoil that ensues. As the writer takes charge of the situation, the attitude shifts towards one of proactive determination and leadership. The choice to urge everyone and huddle them together showcases the narrator's efforts to maintain order and unity, revealing a sense of responsibility and courage in the face of chaos. The use of phrases like instincts kicked in and refuse to surrender to despair highlights the narrator's inner strength and resilience. These actions and decisions underscore the writer's attitude of facing challenges head-on and proactively striving for survival. Moreover, the emphasis on themes of resilience, hope, and the human spirit further deepens the attitude of triumph in the face of despair. The writer's commitment to rationing supplies, maintaining hope, and sharing stories highlights the importance of these actions as sources of strength during adversity. The focus on the power of resilience and the indomitable will underlines the writer's belief in the potential for human endurance and transformation, even in the direst circumstances. In essence, the writer's attitude in the first text towards the sinking ship is a journey that encompasses shock, determination, and eventual triumph. Now, as we just look through some of the levels, look at that introduction, it's really kind of clarifying the question straight away. So that's a really effective way to start, and it is just 2 sentences. So if you can, obviously kind of keep an eye on your time, try and encapsulate the overall attitudes in 1 or 2 sentences at the start, because this is one of your longer questions for the exam, especially the reading section, of course. So it identifies kind of contrasting differences between the attitudes and comments briefly on why and kind of how the writers portray this as well. So I think it's a really, really handy tool to have. I'd put that at level 2 because obviously we need to go a lot further than that. But it's a really good start in terms of making sure that we know it's a comparison when we're marking. It's quite general in that sort of next paragraph, with the writer's attitude being an emotional journey and one of transformative kind of experiences. So that there is just kind of stating some attitudes. We then need to go on further to prove it with methods, and the how starts to come in when it talks about the initial setting creating a stark contrast with the upheaval that follows, and the bit that puts it into level 3 in terms of explaining the effect of writers' methods is that bit where it says the shift in tone from tranquility to chaos serves as a powerful literary device that accentuates the abruptness and shocking nature of the event. So there, that's clear, isn't it? We can't argue with that. That is exactly what the shift in tone does. It really, really makes it clear that it was shocking for them, and the writer conveys that shock so we can feel that shock too through that sudden shift. And again, that is a method. It's a structural method. What this response does really nicely is doesn't just stop there. The shocking nature doesn't just come from the shift in tone, it comes from use of language as well. Phrases like jolted violently and panic ensued that we plan to include. It explains that it doesn't just describe the physical events, but also shows the emotional turmoil as well. So we've got a real kind of multi-layered analysis there, in that it's not just a sudden shock, it's real emotional turmoil. And we can put that at level 4 because it's really considering methods and analysing methods and really building an argument of how that shock conveys the real trouble that the writer was experiencing. It goes further and it uses more and more evidence to begin to prove that as well. So it's really, really good. And again, we can see consistently that the response refers to the question all the time. A little bit further down it says these actions underscore the writer's attitude, facing challenges head on, with quotes like instincts kicked in and huddling everyone together. We planned to use those, didn't we? And it goes back to attitude all the time because that is the focus of your question. Using evidence and methods to show how those attitudes are conveyed. And that how, don't forget, is what we said was really important. And then finally, you've got the emphasis on themes as well, so that's more methods. Themes are being used: resilience, hope, human spirit. It always kind of returns back to those themes throughout. You've got the power of resilience as a quote there, and indomitable will as another quote, and they underline the writer's belief in the potential for endurance. Captures it all in that final sentence. In essence, the writer's attitude in the first text is one that encompasses shock, determination and eventual triumph, which is a really nice way to round off the range of perspectives that we see in that source. So as I said, we've got some level 4 analysis in there certainly, but we cannot hit level 4 without comparing. So let's look at the next slide and just make sure that that's done really well. We can't, even if it's the best analysis in the world, we actually can't get level 4 without comparison. So let's take a look. Looking at the rest, we've got, whilst the first text delves into the narrator's emotional journey and internal struggles, the second text is less concerned with the personal experience of the writer and instead concentrates on the remarkable character of Mr. Terenzi. The writer's tone is notably more detached and objective, focusing less on personal emotions and more on portraying the broader pictures of heroism in the face of danger. Throughout the narrative, the writer emphasises Mr. Terenzi's selflessness and bravery, positioning him as a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The repetition of phrases such as courageous attempts, bravely dives and ultimate sacrifice serves to highlight the extraordinary nature of Mr. Terenzi's actions, aligning the narrative with an attitude of admiration and veneration. The use of these phrases is instrumental in showcasing Mr. Terenzi's unwavering determination to save lives even at great personal risk. The writer's focus on Mr. Terenzi's actions serves as a testament to his selflessness and dedication to helping others. The repetition of phrases such as discovered a poor mariner in the last agonies of exhaustion and feebly buffeting the waves emphasises the dire circumstances faced by the mariner. The writer's emphasis on the mariner's struggle highlights the urgency of the situation, and Mr. Terenzi's subsequent attempts to rescue him underline his innate sense of duty to fellow humans in need. Moreover, the phrase dying hope of being yet enabled of reaching the shore implies the mariner's desperate struggle for survival and his longing for assistance. This depiction further highlights the critical nature of Mr. Terenzi's intervention and underscores his selfless attitude. By showcasing Mr. Terenzi's response to the mariner's dire plight, the writer conveys an attitude of deep empathy and the recognition of the responsibility to offer aid when others are in distress. Overall, the writer's attitude towards the sinking ship in the second text is characterised by reverence for selflessness and duty. The writer's narrative approach underscores the profound impact of acts of heroism and selflessness on the human spirit. Now, these opening few sentences of this part of the response is really, really useful in terms of ensuring that the examiner knows it's a comparison. We've got those first couple of sentences there. While the first text delved into this text does this, and the writer's tone is more this, focusing less on this, but more on this. And it's really, really nice using structures like that. While this one does this one does that. It might be a sentence structure that you practice, and it's less about this but more about this, or vice versa. Practice those sentences because they're really, really handy in terms of really, really capturing the comparison. Really, really clear there, so it's really, really good to make us really aware that it's a comparison. Again, it's really solidifying the analysis of methods with phrases like the use of these phrases is instrumental in showcasing Mr. Dorenzi's determination. That's really nice in the sense that, again, it's not an explicit use of a verb or an adjective, for example, but it's still considering the writer's methods because the writer is doing this to showcase this. That is still analysing methods. Really, really good way of doing it. If you can't find something as obvious as a simile or a metaphor sometimes it's not going to be like that. And again, the writer's emphasis on a little bit further on in that paragraph, and the repetition of phrases such as, and moreover the phrase. You've got this real sense of building on an argument through lots and lots of different means by the writer to convey these attitudes, and the depiction further highlights and underscores his selfless attitude. So it's the writer is doing these things to show this attitude. That still counts as analysing methods. So really, really important that you know that, and that's why I think it's worth practising. Certainly level 4 analysis there again. And then towards the end you've got a real solid link back to the question. The second text is characterised by reverence, selflessness and duty. The writer's narrative approach shows the impact of acts of heroism, and so on. So even in the fact that it's a narrative approach, that again is a method that the writer has used, a narrative approach. So overall, really solid analysis of methods, really solid link back to the question for both extracts as well. We had that at the end of the first and the end of the second. A really solid comparison to make it clear that it is in fact a comparison. So we can have a look at the final kind of mark on the next slide. Looking at the mark scheme then, we've got in level 4, compares ideas and viewpoints insightfully, examines the methods employed by the writers. Yes, it certainly does that. Writers being important, more than one, definitely does that. Really builds a solid argument, specifically in that second one as well. Chooses a thoughtful assortment of supporting details from both pieces. Yes, real range of evidence, and the evidence builds that argument too. If the second one is all about reverence and respect, every single quotation built towards that argument in that closing statement at the end. And then finally demonstrates a deep and discerning understanding of the varied ideas and perspectives present in both texts. We had really lovely closing statements that kind of encompassed everything about the attitudes in both. So the idea of the profound impact of heroism and selflessness in the second one, and in analysis of source A we had it's all about sharp determination and eventual triumph. So it really captures all of those varying attitudes and perspectives throughout as well. So we can definitely tick that one. So in total for this one, really good full marks, 16 out of 16. Okay, so we are up to the big question. That is question 5 worth 40 marks. And what we need to do is just quickly have a look at the mark scheme to make sure that we know what we're aiming for. It's broken down into 2 assessment objectives as well. So there's 2 sides to it. It's important that we know what we're gearing ourselves towards, whether it be for AO5, the content of what we're saying, and whether it be AO6, the SPAG, all about our spelling, punctuation and grammar. Start off with AO5. You'll see there that we've got an upper level 4 and a lower level 4. That's the same for 1, 2 and 3 as well. There's upper and lower in each. And essentially, it's because there's so many marks available for this one in comparison to other questions. So you'll see there we've got 3 marks in lower level 4 and then 3 marks in upper level 4 as well. We'll look at the top, and obviously this is what we're kind of gearing ourselves towards, but essentially it decreases in complexity as it goes down. So the first one says communication is persuasive and engaging. All that means is that your narrative or your piece of writing or your argument is clear and interesting. Now you'll notice I said narrative and argument there. That's because this mark scheme is exactly the same for paper 1 question 5 as well. So actually if you know the mark scheme from descriptive writing, it will help you with this as well. So clear and interesting, it's engaging. We want to continue to see what you've got to say, and that comes through a lot of different things, whether that be clarity or your tone or your humour or your devices or the way you structure your points. It's really important that you focus on making it really engaging, and that comes with practice, of course. Bullet point 2 says the tone, style and register align with the intended purpose and target audience. Now all that means is that you're matching your audience to who you are writing to, and obviously whether that's a speech, it has to kind of sound like a speech, whether that's a letter, it must look like a letter, whether it's an article, in this case it looks like an article. So it's really important that you, again, ensure that you're reading lots and lots of different texts so you know the kind of tone and style for each of those as well. Practice, again, is very important. Bullet point 3 says rich and bold vocabulary coupled with consistent usage of language techniques. That's varying your methods and varying your vocabulary as well. So spoke about this a lot before, but not just varying your vocabulary because you think that you should, you're doing it because it's purposeful to do so. So really thinking carefully about the connotations of your words. I use this example a lot, but it's the best in kind of showing the magnitude of your words. If you were to use the word pass away for someone dying, that's quite gentle, whereas if you said someone was slaughtered, that makes it sound a lot more brutal depending on the kind of narrative that you're hoping to achieve. So it's being really careful because even if it's a synonym, it means the same thing. Technically, words do have different connotations, so be careful with that. Obviously also says about language techniques in there as well. So that can be repetition, similes, metaphors, humour, puns and anecdotes, all of that kind of stuff that really makes a piece of writing what it is. And again, don't forget these bullet points are the same for question 5 in paper 1 and question 5 in paper 2. So where a simile might work in one, repetition or an anecdote might work better in another. So just be careful with making sure your language devices fit the challenge that you've been given, the question that you've been given. Under organisation now, that means how you're putting it together and organising your ideas. You've got creative and diverse application of structural elements. So just varying your structure overall, whether that be sort of building to a final closing mic drop moment. It might be your tone suddenly changes from one of humour to one of seriousness, and there might be real gravity to your words as you continue on. But essentially it's really varying what you need to vary structurally to get your points across, depending on the style of writing and the seriousness of your argument once again. You might finish with the same argument that you began with, and that's just another way of kind of structuring to go sort of almost cyclical in your narrative or your ideas. It could be that you repeat something very similarly throughout. Those things are things that you also need to consider, not just the words that you use. The 5th bullet point says the composition is captivating, featuring a spectrum of intricate and persuasive concepts. So ultimately it's organised in a way to intrigue your reader. You're building to a closing statement, for example, in this particular question. If it's a speech, people want to listen. You've not kind of given everything in the first paragraph. If you're writing a letter, it gets to a point where people want to hear what you have to say because you consider their arguments as well as raising some really strong ones yourself. And finally, you've got smoothly connected paragraphs enriched by effortlessly blended discourse indicators. So your paragraphs flow and they really connect with each other. So your argument in your next paragraph builds on the one you've just made ultimately, and it's really clear that they start and end where they should. You can think about tip-top, time, place, topic, person to help you to know when to change paragraphs as well. That can help certainly with paper 1 question 5 2, and it's just handy little tips like that. And again, this is where practice comes in. I do think it's really important that you spend time practicing these because it's not just something that you'll get good at overnight. You've got to give yourself time to work on them. As we move on to AO6, this is all about your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So again, I've just put level 3 and level 4 there, several bullet points in each, and they build in complexity. So where near the bottom in level 1 it might be some words are spelled accurately, at the top you've got almost accurate spelling, and we'll just go through those in finer detail as well. So in bullet point 1 it says sentence boundaries are consistently defined and consistently precise. So ultimately that just means your grammatical structures really make sense. The way that you kind of use punctuation, full stops, capital letters, commas, we can see where your ideas start and end, where there should be a pause, because without that your writing loses its clarity, and with this question clarity is the most important thing. It's the thing they will judge you on most. So punctuation is important and is absolutely necessary for making sure that your writing makes sense and we understand what is being said. One misplaced punctuation mark can really change the meaning of a sentence ultimately. The next one says a broad spectrum of punctuation is applied with great precision. So again, it's just building on that really. You're varying your punctuation, but it's used with precision as well. So you've got your necessary punctuation like commas and full stops for pauses, but then you've got punctuation that can be used with purpose and precision as well. The next bullet point says employs a comprehensive array of sentence styles for effect. Varying your sentences to really build your argument. So it could be a simple sentence right at the end to really kind of enhance that mic drop moment, that real final closing argument you wish to make. It could be that you've got a sentence that's a lot more detailed, complex sentences to give lots and lots of detail and information. Factual sentences, for example. You can open with different types of words as well. So opening with an adjective or a verb or an adverb. Just really practicing those again. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. Fourth bullet point says consistently and aptly employ standard English with a firm grasp of intricate grammatical constructs. So ultimately your English is correct. You're not using the word gonna, you're saying going to, for example. Just writing how you should write on paper rather than how you'd write in a text message, for example. The fifth bullet point says excellent spelling precision, including challenging vocabulary choices. So almost perfect spelling. And I say almost because they're not going to take all of those marks away from you just because of one misspelt word. But consistently, generally, your spelling is really good. And then finally, you've got expansive and bold vocabulary use. Now you'll see that vocabulary comes up in AO5 and AO6, so this is almost double marked. So it's especially important in terms of making sure you secure some marks. If nothing else, that's absolutely the one thing that you need to practice, varying your vocabulary. So really seeing the impact of words, not just using them because you think that you should, like I said previously, but varying them for effect as well. So we've had a look at this mark scheme, so we'll have a look at the question now in full and we'll start to form a plan to help us with a decent and solid response. Looking at the question then, a couple of tips just before we get going. Obviously 45 minutes spent on this section. You should write in full sentences, of course, that builds in with AO6. You're reminded of the need to plan, hence why we're doing it, and you should leave enough time to check your work at the end. Obviously when you're in a rush, sometimes the pressure can get to you a little bit. It's important to just have a little flip back through, make sure everything makes sense. And the question here, always get given a statement. Our one is survival skills should be a part of the school curriculum, and then you'll get a task based on that statement. You're being asked to write a speech encouraging secondary school students to be hyper vigilant during the summer holidays. As we said, 24 marks for AO5 and 16 for AO6, totaling 40. Now, when we get given a question, the very first thing that I would do is just grab your highlighter or your pen and underline using a MAP, which stands for mode, audience and purpose, just so you really know what you're pushing towards. The mode, in this case, is what it's actually asking you to do, the style of writing you're being asked to conform to. That's a speech, so we've got that as our mode. Our audience is secondary school students, and our purpose is encouraging them to be hyper vigilant, in other words, really careful during the summer holidays. Now that we've kind of clarified that as well, that allows us to think, right, well, I'm writing a speech, so this is meant to be heard. Obviously you're writing it down, so you've still got to write it, but a speech is there to be heard, so we're thinking about how we might say these things out loud. We know that it's to secondary school students, so we might be a little bit more colloquial. And when I say colloquial, we're still writing in standard English, but our tone can be a little bit more chatty, it can be a little bit more informal. Doesn't mean that we should write like it's a text, of course, like we said with IO6 previously. And we know our purpose, so we need to be thinking about arguments that prove why we need to be so careful during the summer holidays. So we need to think of examples of dangers that can occur during those times and how we might tackle them, and how we might tackle them in a way where it doesn't feel threatening because of our audience needs to be age appropriate, maybe a little bit kind of chatty, a little bit of humour quite subtly where it's relevant, obviously not mocking serious situations. Those are the things that we need to consider, and using math will allow you to do that. So we'll start off with planning our introduction, and the way that I would do this is by thinking in GST, general, specific and thesis. Now we've got other videos on this, so do watch them. The previous paper walkthrough for paper 2 also shows you another example if you'd like to see it. But it just means generally, what are we going to be talking about? More specific. And then thesis is the argument you're going to be pressing on with throughout the rest of your piece of writing. So for me, obviously, generally, we're talking about summer holidays. We need to get that in there. Specifically, we'll be talking about survival skills. And then the thesis, I'm going to go down the idea of, well, why do we need to actually look at survival skills when we've got our smartphones anyway with GPS that will help us kind of find our way and for people to find us? Well, you can use that idea. Well, some of you might be wondering, well, why do I need it? And this is why. This is why you need those survival skills. The first 2 kind of paragraphs are going to go down that road. I'm going to use a picture this paragraph in terms of really setting the scene and establishing my audience, getting them to really visualise the situation that they're in, going on a camping trip, really excited, but then suddenly they hear something. This is where I want to bring in one of my arguments. They hear a rustling, they're camping, and it's not some cute little animal that they expected, it's something quite monstrous and dangerous. So I can put that across in a really sort of grave and serious way, or I can kind of make a joke about it. But of course that humour has to be appropriate. We can't be joking about really serious and grave things. We're maybe kind of putting it across in a way where you expect something really lovely, turns out to be terrifying. Just remember, if you encounter something terrifying, don't try to tickle it. Just something silly like that. I'm not saying it's laugh out loud hilarious, but just kind of humour to suit your audience, because you're then showing your examiner that you're thinking about the audience. You're not writing to a member of parliament, you're talking to secondary school students, so you can kind of use tone and a bit more of a silly and humorous tone and a light tone to get across your points. So one of my topics is about creatures while camping, and then I might kind of shift the tone a little bit to something more serious in my next paragraph. Jokes aside, survival skills are important. So let's look specifically at water. That's another thing that we need to focus on. Water safety, because lots of people get into trouble in water when they don't know how to sort of tackle it, especially if it's open water as well, or there's no kind of assistance nearby. Now, water's the one that I really want to hone in on. So for this one, this is where it's going to be a lot more detailed. I might kind of start off with one rule: never swim alone. Include again, quite colloquial, chatty language, and use a pun of the idea of diving into this important topic as well. I want to use collective pronouns and direct address here to really make it sound like an inclusive topic that essentially applies to me as well. So things like, now I know some of us might da-da-da, but if you're not quite there yet, da-da-da. So the I, the us, the you, the we, all of that kind of stuff. So it sounds really doable because I'm involved as well. Don't forget I'm thinking about my audience there. Another thing that's important when considering water safety is the signs that you see out and about at the beach or near natural bodies of water. And again, I can sort of use really subtle humour and really colloquial language to emphasise the importance of it in a really gentle way for my audience again. So they're not just there to be ignored, they're not just there for decoration, they indicate real dangers. And I can hone in on some of those dangers like strong currents and so on. Again, I might use those collective pronouns. We don't want you to be in trouble, we don't want this, we don't want that. I might use some repetition of we don't want you to be in any danger. And to really emphasise the risks, we want to be talking with quite dramatic vocabulary, words like treacherous, painful, real dangers, serious. So we want to use those words to really emphasise the gravity of the situation. Yes, I'm talking in a friendly tone to these students, but I do need to get across how important water safety is. My last point will be about hydration, making sure they're drinking lots and lots of water. Just another tip, because this is what you want to be doing. You want to be thinking about lots of different points that you want to make. I've mentioned animals, I've mentioned water safety, specifically in terms of signs, being hydrated, and so on. And then finally, to close, after I've kind of made my 3 key points, my 3 ideas, I want to round it up and really hit home with the point I'm making. So let's embrace this together. Let's embrace this safety together. Being vigilant, being water wise, going back to that question. And then really use that kind of idea of collectiveness to emphasise let's all do this together so it feels more achievable for my readers. So stuff like, so my friends, stay safe, be water wise, and let's make this summer the best one yet. I'm going to use that as a closing sentence and a closing paragraph so it really stands out and really hits home. That's the point, and it goes back to my thesis by the end as well. And we want to try and do that. Really, really nice structural feature is to go back to what you started with. We talked about summer, we talked about being safe this summer, so close with those words, close with those ideas, and that's why I've kind of planned that sentence early to make sure I'm doing that. Ultimately, you don't necessarily have to plan the full sentence, but planning the idea that you're going to go back to, that you started with, is handy because then you know how to get there. So now we've got our plan, we'll have a look at how this writing comes together, how it conforms to the mark scheme, and how potentially it could be improved as well. Okay, so we'll have a little read and we'll mark as we go, as we did with the previous ones, looking out for some of the features that are really quite nice and things that could maybe be improved as well. So it starts off with, as we gear up for the summer holidays, let me take a moment to talk about a topic that's more thrilling than a roller coaster ride: survival skills. Now, some of you might be wondering, survival skills? Why do I need those when I have my trusty smartphone with GPS? Well, my friends, as much as we love our gadgets, let's face it, they aren't always dependable. Your phone might be your best buddy in snapping selfies, but when you're lost in the middle of nowhere, it can quickly turn into a high-tech paperweight. So what's nice there straight away is that we've got the question being answered straight away. It's all about survival skills, and we know that. So it's really hitting the point of the question. And in terms of GST, the general, specific, and then thesis, you've got the general being the summer holidays, like we said, specific being more about survival skills. We need to talk about this topic, and then we've got the thesis being, well, why do I need them? Because it can quickly kind of turn nasty, essentially. So we've got there as well some direct address early on. Don't forget, this is a speech, it's meant to be heard. And we've got some suitable cultural references for our audience in terms of gadgets, snapping selfies, all of that kind of stuff, really appealing to our audience. Thinking about what they might be thinking. Why do I need those when I have my smartphone? Why do I need to worry? So really kind of connecting with the audience early on there, so establishing our audience a little bit. Let's carry on. It says, so picture this, you and your buddies set out for a camping trip, you're all excited, the tent is up and the s'mores are sizzling. Suddenly, you hear a mysterious rustling sound nearby. Now, is it a cute forest critter or is it a giant, hairy, marshmallow-eating monster? You'll never know unless you've brushed up on your survival skills. Speaking of creatures, nature has its fair share of unique characters. Some are friendly and fluffy like bunnies and squirrels, but others, not so much. Just remember, if you encounter something with big sharp teeth, don't try to tickle it. Now this bit here, the picture this, kind of sets out to establish the audience further. You're really kind of letting them know that you're on their level. With the bit about the camping trip, it's something that people might do at summer. Get another cultural reference, trying to kind of get into your audience's head. Using a bit of an anecdote there as well. Hear a mysterious sound. You're kind of using a bit of silly humour there with the idea of giant hairy monster. You'll never know unless you've brushed up on your survival skills. So again, you're going back to that point, but in a really light-hearted kind of way. Just remember, if you encounter something with big sharp teeth, don't try to tickle it. So they're, again, quite humorous, could maybe improve their vocabulary a little bit there, but it suits the kind of joke that's being made and the audience that you're speaking to as well. It's not too kind of challenging in terms of getting the point across. Next, it says, jokes aside, survival skills are no laughing matter, and as we embrace the summer holidays with open arms, let's take a moment to dive into an essential topic that concerns our safety near water. Yes, I'm talking about being vigilant and water-wise. The waters might be alluring, but it is crucial to be cautious and prepared to ensure our summer remains full of joy and free from harm. So here is where it kind of shifts tone quite significantly. Jokes aside, this is no laughing matter. This is what we need to dive into, and we've got that pun there as well. So that's handy in terms of keeping it light, but still really going in on that serious level that we need to explore with our audience. So register is always being considered and tone is always being considered, and that's something that's really effective here in terms of kind of level 4 consideration of tone. It then kind of explores the idea of the waters might be alluring, but it's crucial to be cautious. You've got that alliteration there, crucial to be cautious. Some more higher level vocabulary now than maybe previously as we get into the more serious stuff. And then again, we've got free from harm, so more alliteration, not necessarily purposeful, but we've got some more in there too, just kind of building on our devices. And then we've got our collective pronouns. Let us take a moment to dive in. Our safety, to ensure our summer remains full of joy. So it's not just them that needs to consider this, it's me as well, and that makes it all the more relatable for my audience. Next, we've got, now we all love a good splash in the water, whether it's at the beach, a lake or a pool. But as we indulge in aquatic adventures, let's remember these vital tips to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. First and foremost, the golden rule, never swim alone. Always have a buddy by your side, because in the water, having someone looking out for you can make all the difference. Now, I know some of us might be champion swimmers, but if you're not quite there yet, don't fret. Take the opportunity to learn proper swimming techniques. Knowing how to swim not only boosts our confidence, but is an essential life skill that can save us in times of need. And when we're at the beach or near natural bodies of water, pay close attention to those warning signs. They're not just there for decoration, they indicate real dangers like strong currents and riptides. Ignoring them could lead to serious trouble. And I'll carry that bit on onto the next slide. So if we just look at what we've got there, we've got the kind of understanding and appreciation of, yes, we all love a good splash, but, and then it gets serious again. Let's remember these vital tips. You've got that language of it being quite crucial. Vital tips, they're important. And then you've got that colon there to kind of introduce the most important thing in that paragraph. First and foremost, the golden rule, never swim alone. And punctuation really accentuates that point there, so it's nice and varied there. Ambitious and correct in terms of its use as well. And again, it's nice because it takes into account that it's speaking to a larger audience rather than just a single person, or addressing a single person, because it says, I know some of us might be good swimmers, but if you're not there yet, don't fret. And it addresses lots of different people. It's really quite inclusive there as well. And the benefits of learning to swim are considered, so it goes a little bit deeper into that point. It's better in terms of this point that's been made, as opposed to the sort of camping trip one that was raised before. And this next bit's really quite nice in the sense that it gives meaningful and appropriate advice about the signs as well. Going on to say we don't want that, that's what I was talking about in the plan. Really kind of important use of collective pronouns. Once again, always used throughout, and that advice is really specific. So in terms of the writing being really quite compelling and engaging, that helps because it's clear. It's not general and sweeping there, it's more in depth this time. And it's those things that maybe we forget about in terms of survival skills that have been considered, which is much better as we go further through this piece. And we'll finish this bit off on the next slide. And it says, speaking of dangers, let's be mindful of the water's depth before we take that daring dive or jump. Shallow waters can be treacherous and we don't want any painful encounters with the bottom. Lastly, don't forget to stay hydrated. Dehydration can lead to accidents and cramps in the water, so keep that water bottle close and take sips regularly. Let's embrace the refreshing waters of summer with joy and enthusiasm, but also with a sense of responsibility. By being vigilant and waterwise, we can ensure that our summer holidays remain filled with unforgettable memories of laughter and fun. So, my friends, stay safe, be waterwise, and let's make this summer the best one yet. Now you'll see there we've got that repetition of we don't want that, because again, it's really meaningful advice and it's related to the task in terms of survival skills and important tips to help young people. They're not too serious, they're not too unachievable, they're really simple. So it's a nice conversational way of adhering to the task and adhering to the purpose as well. Then we've got that kind of closing statement, let's embrace the refreshing waters of summer with joy and enthusiasm, but also with a sense of responsibility. So it gets to that point in terms of it being really compelling. We really, really want to hear the advice, and then how it rounds up. By being vigilant and waterwise, we can ensure our summer holidays remain filled with unforgettable memories. So it goes back to the idea of it being really, really positive if we follow these tips. And then, so my friends, stay safe, be waterwise, and let's make this summer the best one yet. A nice use of triple there, and it really rounds up everything that's been said. It goes back to the thesis in terms of adhering to some structural features as well. So what we'll do is have a look through the mark scheme, see what we've achieved in terms of marks. If we start off with AO5 in terms of the mark scheme, I'm going to say that I'm actually going to put this one in lower level 4, but I will explain why. And I'll show you potentially how it could have hit upper level 4 as well. So if we start off with communication effectively persuades in lower level 4, the difference is that it effectively persuades or it's persuasive at the top. And essentially, I just thought that sometimes the engagement lacks a little bit, not enough to really knock it down to level 2 or 3. It makes perfect sense and it's clear communication, but sometimes it kind of switches topics quite quickly. So we mentioned the camping and the kind of creatures that you might come across. Perhaps that could have been explored a little bit further in terms of how to deal with it. There could have been a bit more focus on morality in terms of the messy approach that we looked at in the previous video. If you go and watch that one too, it could focus a bit more on morality in terms of how to support your friends and the benefits of doing so. Could have been really important. And then if we look at the next bullet point, you've got tone, style and register are decisively aligned to the intent and audience. There's an effective use of humour throughout. We kind of picked up on that as we marked it. But I think there could also be a little bit more seriousness to it as well. Teenagers are capable of understanding the gravity of a situation if you put it across to them, and what better way to do that with than with potentially statistics to really hit home with the fact that yes, you do need to hear this. So we could have included that a little bit more just to make it a bit more suitable where we shifted tone. So we did shift tone to a little bit more seriousness, but we could have really hit home with that a little bit more with things like statistics, just to make it a bit more real for our listeners. The third one says broad vocabulary paired with deliberate use of language devices. Yes, we've got varied vocabulary, and yes, we've got deliberate use of language techniques as well. It's obvious that some have been used on purpose. Humour, there is lots and lots of collective pronouns and this inclusive kind of language used throughout. So yes, absolutely, we can tick it in lower level 4, but just in terms of rich and bold vocabulary in upper, I don't think it quite hit that one as such. The vocabulary was a little bit sort of limited at points, not the whole way throughout, but at points. The next one says diverse and impactful structural elements. Now with this one, we can definitely tick it. It's impactful. It really rounds up to that point towards the end, but I wouldn't say it's creative and diverse in terms of its structure. I think they could have really emphasised at the end the thesis a little bit more, just to make it really clear and really almost kind of hitting that mic drop moment and really, really hitting home with the gravity of that situation. It's potentially a little bit too light throughout, and considering our audience as secondary students, it could be a little bit more weighted in terms of the gravity of it. The next bullet point says the narrative captivates, showcasing a spectrum of well-formed, intricate concepts. Again, yes, we can definitely tick that one. It is captivating. It is definitely compelling in terms of how we want to read it, and we want to hear these tips. But just in terms of comparing it to upper level 4 again, I wouldn't say there's a spectrum of intricate and persuasive concepts. It's the persuasive element there that falls down just a little bit with that argument about the camping trip with the animals and the creatures again. Could have made a little bit more of it. Could have been something that we returned to at the end again in terms of structure, it being cyclical. Doesn't always quite flow in terms of that. So it just kind of, I think it's that idea that we could have expanded on generally throughout. Now that last bullet point, uniformly structured paragraphs complemented by cohesive discourse cues. Yes, we've definitely got uniform paragraphs, they're very well structured. I just wouldn't say they were smoothly connected at the top, again, with effortlessly blended discourse indicators. For example, there's a bit towards the end where it talks about hydration, but that's still part of the paragraph with the signs. We're talking about changing topic with new paragraphs, that could have been a separate paragraph as well, just so it makes a little bit more sense structurally to make that point stand out on its own. And in terms of AO6 now, we're going to go with 14 out of 16 for this, and again I will tell you why. Sentence boundaries are consistently defined and consistently precise. Yeah, there's not a problem with communication in that sense. We know where the pauses are, we know where the full stops are. And a broad spectrum of punctuation is applied with great precision. We've got colons, semicolons, exclamation marks, a range of commas, questions as well. It's really well used in this piece, actually, really varied. So that one is absolutely level 4. Employs a comprehensive array of sentence styles for effect. There are a range of sentences. I think the only thing that was maybe missing was just some punchy, simple sentences as well, where there's something really crucial to point out to readers, or listeners in this case. So I'm going to put that one in level 3. There are diverse sentence structures for effect. Comprehensive, I think, is the key word there, so we're going to put that one in level 3. Consistently and aptly employs standard English with a firm grasp of intricate grammatical constructs. Standard English is really brilliantly tackled in this one because we can fall into the trap when we have to be colloquial and chatty to kind of lose that, but it uses it with flair and only when necessary as well, so really well done on that one. Excellent spelling precision, yes. Including challenging vocabulary choices, yeah, we can tick that one. Expansive and bold vocabulary use, I'm going to put that one in level 3, just as I did in AO5 as well. We've got the sense of vocabulary definitely being considered, but it could just be a little bit more varied throughout as well. We've got 14 out of 16 there, 21 out of 24 on AO5, so in total we've got 35 out of 40.
Oh, well done for making it to the end of the paper, guys. This was a really long one, and you definitely deserve to go for a break now.